check that that mix didn't get bumped.
Why is the gain on?
Double check that the mix didn't get bumped.
Because it should be all the way on.
Yeah.
On playback, right?
It should be pointing towards me and all the way down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They said reference. All right. Go ahead.
I'll raise it slowly again.
Test. Check. I'm talking. Hello.
It's at Unity.
Alright, nudge back down a little bit.
-5.
Alright, and then pick it down to -10.
-10.
Yeah. Then if someone in Zoom can chat say something real fast. You're virtual and mute. So you're a little quiet in here, but I can hear you. So that might be what we do.
Keep it there.
You might have to write that a little bit because it seems like for whatever reason no, it's not you.
We're not resetting the room.
No, that box is all. You can Check.
Alright. It's still kind of happening. Alright, right.
Can you hear me? Yes, start.
All right.
Yeah, get started. Sorry.
Okay, bring an audio in.
This is the April 25th, 2023 Planning Commission meeting for the City of Fort Myers. I'll provide a quick overview of tonight's agenda and then
evening, Commissioners. Patricia Diefender for the record, reviewing planning and sustainability. I don't have any updates to provide in the director's report this evening.
Next up is our consent agenda. Do we have a motion to accept, and the only item are the minutes from the April 11th commission meeting. Okay, Commissioner Alexander, is there a second? Commissioner Lang, all in favor? Aye. Motion carries. So next up, we have the parking compliance amendments project. I'm going to call up staff, Sandra Wood and JP McNeil. Before they provide the overview, are there any conflicts of interest for commissioners to report on this item? Seeing none indicating, welcome Sandra and JP.
Good afternoon, commissioners. For the record, I'm Jake McNeil, the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Just bear with me 1 moment while I pull up this presentation.
And I believe, Sandra and JP will be introducing an amendment as well as part of the presentation.
Yes. All right. Okay, so, we are here tonight to talk about the Parking Compliance Amendments Project. This is a project that is a zoning code project to bring our zoning code into compliance with the state's climate-friendly equitable communities rules. As you most, I'm sure you recall, I was here to give a briefing back in mid-March, and 2 weeks ago, we held a hearing on this project here. And as a quick reminder, the proposals that were included in the proposed draft are to amend the code to remove minimum parking requirements citywide, to update and simplify maximum parking requirements, and to add new development standards for large parking lots. And as was just mentioned, there is an amendment being proposed to the proposed draft, and that is to standards for elderly and disabled housing for bicycle parking. And so the amendment is to put, it will close a loophole for lower bike parking allowances for elderly and disabled housing. And so what that entails, there's essentially, there is a chapter, the elderly and disabled housing chapter, and in that chapter there's some incentives for elderly and disabled housing, such as increased density or the bike parking allowances. And in 2019, there was a bike parking project that moved the allowances for lowered bike parking to the parking chapter, where there's a section of bicycle parking. And so the bicycle parking in 229 lowered amount was intended to recognize that there's less demand for bicycle parking for elderly and disabled residents. And it's also tied to a covenant that for elderly and disabled housing, developers have to submit that says that they'll meet certain design features and requirements and restrict the or ensure that the housing is for elderly and disabled residents. And so by moving the standard out of that chapter, it separated the requirement, the covenant requirement from the parking allowances. And so by moving the bicycle parking standard from the parking chapter back to the elderly and disabled housing chapter, it will make that enforceable again. So that's the rationale for the proposal. I believe that Commissioner Thompson will be making the amendment, but before we pass it along to her, I'm going to pass it to Sandra Wood, just to give a quick training lecture.
Thanks, JP. Good afternoon, Sandra Wood with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. As you know, we're trying to provide some orientation and onboarding for
talk about this, all the questions are answered, hopefully you call the roll, and then we'll just vote on that motion. And then the sixth, the presiding officer announces the results of the vote and announces the next business. So for this project, we have a proposed draft before you. We worked with Commissioner Thompson to propose an amendment, so you'll be doing a motion, a second, a vote on the amendment, and then we'll do the same process of
my question was surrounding that, and I remember the city asked the development community which building requirements of the city should consider changing to help support increase housing production, and my school requirements were referenced the most in the survey results. And so my question was, basically just to clarify that the purpose of the amendment is to tighten up code language to eliminate a loophole that was not originally intended to exist, as opposed to adding additional by school regulations that could impede housing production. Is my understanding correct?
But I'll just jump in really quickly to say, sorry, Tricia Tiefender for Chief Planner DPS. So the development survey that you're talking about raises issues about parking more broadly. That is not what we're dealing with here. I think that's what Commissioner or Vice Chair Thompson was alluding to, is that this is not trying to address or solve what might be that larger bike parking consideration. This is merely to address, as you noted, just this loophole that sort of disassociated the reduction in bike parking for housing that serves elderly and disabled from the covenant agreement that ensures that is in fact who's gonna occupy the units. Does that make sense? And we're just trying to tie those back together so that people don't take advantage of a reduction and then aren't ultimately, that housing is not ultimately serving disabled and elderly. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely does. Thanks for that clarification. Because that survey did broadly note by school requirements, but I couldn't find any further details on that. So thank you.
This is, Chair O'Meara for the record. So on the covenant, what is, the duration of that is as long as the structure is in place essentially. If the deed changed ownership, right, that next owner would still, that covenant would be passed down, so they would essentially have
today we're here to brief you on the rate-making process for single-family residential collection system. So today's briefing is just an informational item for you and give you a chance to have a little bit of discussion. Next time for you in a couple of weeks, we'll be bringing proposed rates for the 23-24 calendar year, sorry, fiscal year for single-family garbage recycling collection. So I would like to turn it over to Lisa Bauer, who is our service operations manager, to walk us through the presentation. That was the one that works.
Thanks, Evan. Good afternoon or good evening, commissioners. My name is Rick Bauer, and as I mentioned, I'm the Communities Operations Manager at Zero Planning Sustainability. I oversee the operations side of our solid waste system. Just as a reminder, our curbside collection includes single-family homes and duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. Those are the only parts of our franchise system. Commercial and larger multifamily properties are an open market system. So you can see here on the slide, we've got a lot more commercial multifamily properties, but that's not what we're talking about today. We're just talking about residential curbside collection. This is already set in our franchise plans. Properties with 5 or more units and businesses are part of that commercial sector, and we don't set those rates. So we manage the residential collection system through multiple things: for recycling waste education, reduce our environmental climate footprint, deliver financially sustainable collection service with good jobs, and of course we are always moving forward with an equity focus. But today we're really laser focused on the annual rate review for the residential collection system, which has a pretty set process that we go through. I'd also like to acknowledge those climate and equity goals. However, our solid waste fund pays for that climate work, and our program does climate work. We also have ongoing work focused on equity, including a low income rate assistance program that we are rolling out next year, and that will be incorporated into next year, the following year's rates. We're also going into a franchise review process that we do every 5 years, and that is going to include a deeper evaluation of our equity goals. So now I'm going to go over the process for setting the rates, as well as the initial look at major rate drivers affecting rates this year. So as they do every year, the haulers have submitted their detailed cost reports, or what we call DCRs. Those contain their revenues and costs for the previous calendar year 2020. We then have a contract with CPA firm, which is just completed its review of those DCRs for the haulers that were selected for the sample to ensure that all costs are allowed and documented. So rather than taking into account the cost for all of the haulers, we just do a subset of those. They need to represent at least 75% of the customer base and at least 3 different haulers. This year we included 5 haulers that represent 82% of the customer base. To calculate those rates, we take a sample of the sample hauler's costs and average an MTO per customer deposit cost. Those rates are designed to cover the average cost to provide the service and allow the haulers to have the opportunity to earn 9.5% operating margin. Those rates also include currently a 5% franchise fee that comes to the planning sustainability to fund our operational costs. Once we have established the cost to provide utility service, VPS applies discounts to smaller garbage cans and adds disincentive rates to the larger garbage service levels to incentivize customers to reduce waste and recycle and compost. So here are the current major service levels available to customers. The trend of folks right-sizing their garbage containers while many were home due to the pandemic has continued over this past year. The 35-gallon roll cart collected at Red Butte is still the most common service level, while the 60 and 90-gallon roll carts have increased slightly in popularity, so about a 1% change. We saw that in the previous year and last year as well, that people are just slightly shifting to those larger containers as they were producing more waste at home. And while we obviously want to encourage thoughtful consumption, waste reduction, recycling, and composting, we also want to encourage customers to find the right size service for their household. Because we want to make sure folks have room for all their garbage in their container rather than maybe doing a lot of wishful recycling that contributes to contamination and makes it more expensive for us to process and market our recycling. Additionally, if you get too aggressive with those incentives on small units and disincentives So now let's talk about some of the key cost factors that are driving the rate this year. First off, we are proposing a adjustment to our franchise fee. So due to increased operating costs and inflation, residential revenue is no longer sufficient to maintain BPS programs or support the solid waste recycling system. Because of these, we're proposing to increase the fee on total haul revenue from 5% to 8%. So those costs have to be passed on to customers, which will require increased rates. Additionally, it's probably no surprise to anyone, we have some inflation adjustments this year. After we have last year's average cost, we're going to make the adjustments for that inflation. It is important to note that inflation is not added to current rates, but applied to the actual costs of providing service. So you don't take the rate and then say inflation was up 8%, so the entire rate's going to go up 8%, right? You take the actual cost incurred by the haulers and integrate that inflation costs. This way, reduced operating costs can mitigate the effect of inflationary pressure. Since we're making rates for the 23-24 fiscal year, the inflation forecast is for the 18-month period of January 23 through June of 24. So based on that, we're looking at about a 2.8% inflation on an annualized basis. We also adjust labor costs, taking into account union contracts and general cost of living. Currently, that's looking like it'll be around a 10% increase on an annualized basis. Next up, we look at fuel costs, and diesel prices are projected to decrease about 20% next year. We do have a number of haulers that have switched to compressed natural gas vehicles, and CNG prices are also expected to decrease by approximately 16%. So based on that weighted average of fuel mix, the rates will include fuel costs that are about 19.5% lower than the hauler's fuel costs for 2022. So that's kind of the one bright spot is fuel costs going down. The 2022 composite cost contains significant increases due to inflation. When the inflationary adjustments are made, the rate components for garbage, recycling, and organics collection are all expected to increase by about 10 to 15% overall. The next costs that we include are garbage disposal costs. Those reflect the amount of garbage disposed and the price haulers pay to tip their garbage at Metro's transfer stations or other private transfer stations in the area, which also includes the cost to send the waste to the landfill. This year, that tip fee, Metro has proposed to increase by about 9.2%. So that's going to go from approximately going to approximately $134.81 a pound. So it looks like that's about close to a $13 increase per ton in the Metro fee. We check the amount of garbage in two ways. First, the haulers report how much they collect, and then we also contract with Community Environmental Services at PSU to weigh a sample of individual garbage carts several times a year so we get a sense of how much the different size carts weigh and can price them appropriately. This is also a double check on the amounts of garbage collected from residents. And so far we've seen those weights have gone down or have increased, or no, gone down just a little bit this year, as people are now eating out more than eating at home. So we also have costs for yard debris and food scraps. And again, Metro is increasing their tip fee about 4.5% to $87.15 a ton. And then lastly, recycling rates are taken into effect. And as many of you know, revenue from recycled materials used to be an offset to the rates. So haulers actually used to get paid for the recycling materials that they took in. But in 2017, that shifted worldwide due to a drop in recycled material prices and increased processing costs at recycling sorting facilities. Since then, haulers have now been charged for processing their recycling materials. Prices for recycling materials deteriorated in 2022 relative to 21, and that will put upward pressure on the rates. So in summary, inflation, poor recycling materials markets, and higher tip fees have combined to put significant material upward pressure on the rates. We're still working on what the final rates will look like at this point, but the increase will likely fall between a 10 and 14% increase, which is quite a bit above the normal increase from year to year. We will be back with those final rates at the May 9th hearing for this group. And then we will take that and recommend that to City Council on May 24th, and then those rates take effect on July 1st through June 30th of the following year. With that ends our presentation. Any questions for us?
Thank you. Any questions from commissioners? Commissioner Ling.
Thank you.
The metro tipping fee, that 9+%, what was it in previous years? Is that substantially higher?
Well, this would be a second consecutive year of an increase that's around 8%. Last year, Metro Council approved a disposal fee increase concept that would most likely result in about 8% increases every year for about a 5-year period. And that was framed as a way to kind of manage expectations for fee increases over that period.
So
the most recent increases that Metro has made in disposal have been significant compared to prior years.
Yeah. Okay. And I was curious too. This used to be the Planning Sustainability Committee or Commission. Will this ultimately go to the Sustainability Commission?
That's what we anticipate.
Okay.
Yeah, Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. That's correct. This is an item that, per the code, requires a stop-it commission, but in the future it will be the Climate Sustainability Commission rather than this commission. But you're doing a service on this in this regard right now, so we thank you for that.
And if you realize that this is really fascinating to you, then maybe in the future consider applying for the Sustainability Commission.
Thank
Other
you
questions?
both. I am really interested in the income reduction that you have stated would be effective as of the next year rate increase cycle. Is that right? Is there any sense of how much that reduction in terms of a percentage rate, or is there more research needed to really determine what that scale will look like and how folks will qualify?
Yeah, we're just kicking off that process. We're getting a contract in place with Marina, the same company that does the analysis of those DCRs I mentioned. And so they'll be working with us on stakeholder engagement and comparing it to other jurisdictions' plans. And then we'll be moving forward with that. There is an interest to align it with other city programs, particularly the Water Bureau's existing low-income rate assistance program.
Great, thank you. I see both Commissioner Alexander and Commissioner Spivak have their hand raised. Commissioner Alexander, go ahead.
Right. I was curious, you spoke about the distribution of cart sizes across customer base. The responsibility for sort of communicating the ability to sort of go larger or go smaller, does that lie with the haulers or with BPS? I've been a resident for 12 years and I noticed the changes with my neighbors, but I don't know that I've ever sort of seen incentive or disincentive to sort of make that decision. Who communicates that?
I believe it's really a shared responsibility. So we have a whole education and outreach team, and that team is responsible for communicating our rate structure and encouraging people to make the most sustainable choices in their and how they manage their waste, right? But then the haulers also have responsibilities to distribute our materials to all the customers, to new customers, and existing customers throughout the year. So it's really, I think, a shared responsibility.
Yeah, if one of our franchised collectors, is seeing a consistent overflow in a garbage cart, they might reach out to that customer and encourage them to change their capacity. The incentives that were mentioned earlier as part of the rates are really are kind of invisible, right? We're just trying to, through monetary mechanism, make a slight adjustment to very slightly encourage folks to generate less waste. Does that answer your question, Commissioner?
Okay. Commissioner Spivak?
Thank you. This may be a little bit of an update, but also a question. DEQ, Oregon DEQ has $8 million available in a grant round right now to electrify trash recycling haulers. And I understand Portland haulers have had reasonable success. 1 out of 2 were funded in the past couple of years that applied. But also the local haulers sometimes have a challenge going through the application process because it's not their core business to apply for grants. So I wanted to check in to confirm that Portland will help its haulers who are interested apply for funding to get these more efficient trucks. And the question kind of is, and I know staff's already tracking this, but if someone does get a big grant to cover a new truck, is that just on the margins, or does that actually affect rates if someone outside of Portland ends up paying for such a large capital cost for a hauler?
Well, a truck can cost, moving up towards upwards of $500,000. And that starts to be at a size where, that's a somewhat meaningful cost in the system. There are a lot of trucks, and the cost for those trucks is being depreciated over multiple years. So it would take a little doing to find out, essentially what the financial benefit of a truck that we didn't have to pay for would be. We could look into that and answer the question for you if you'd like. As far as our role in encouraging the electrification, or at least the reduction in emissions from our garbage fleet, that's something we've been really active on and will continue to be active around. Whether that's encouraging our collectors, making sure they're aware of the upcoming grant opportunities, or if need be, providing them with access to folks who might know a little bit more about electric trucks to bolster their applications. That's the kind of thing we could do.
Vice Chair Thompson. I have a question about the franchise agreement process and where we're at, or what the status is with that.
Our franchise agreement typically lasts for a 12-year term, but it provides an opportunity in the 5th year of each franchise term for the city to pause basically and review and ask the question, how well does the franchise serve our community, and are there ways to make incremental improvements in the way that it serves the community? And at the end of the 6-month review process that happens at that 5-year period, which we just launched just about a month ago, at the end of that 6-month process, the City Council has the opportunity, if they so choose, to renew the term with a revised franchise agreement, and that starts a new 12-year term.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Within that process, can you talk about how community benefit, how those goals are advanced within the context of the discussion, and what sorts of opportunities there are? When we had this discussion over a year ago, there was a lot of focus on BIPOC participation and local small hauler participation, co-bid businesses. And at the time, what we heard was that, well, that's not really part of this discussion, that's part of the franchise agreement. And so I'm just, wanting to bring that up again, because it's something that there is a lot of interest, and even though we don't have a sustainability commission, I think it's really important that these things don't get lost, or waylaid. But also I'm just genuinely curious, what sorts of opportunities there are for those discussions in that agreement process.
Yeah. A couple of things come to mind, but can you first just clarify for me? You said you were talking about this about 6 months ago
I think it
in
was
this space?
a calendar year or so. If this happens at the same time every year, spring, April.
Okay, so it may have been the prior year's rate review process. Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
The last franchise review process that was initiated in the 2017 and 18 timeframe, and then finalized, I think, in early 2019, did a fairly deep dive look at how the residential franchise system could be revised or updated to create opportunities for, let's say, BIPOC-owned businesses, for example, to participate in the system. And at the same time as well, there was some additional efforts undertaken to request demographic information from our franchisees. And a number of things have happened in the intervening years since then. For example, collectors, the franchisees have initiated and had almost 100 folks graduate from a program called Driving Diversity, which seeks to bring in new folks to train as drivers for vehicles, people of color. And another piece that the city has been looking at more intentionally is using its own procurement power. For example, through the public collection contracts that we hold, which are now awarded to co-bid firms. And so I guess what I want to say is that after the last franchise review process, the conclusion was that the opportunities that the city had to make significant change in waste and recycling were primarily in spaces outside the franchise, in places where we had more direct leverage. That said, we will still keep looking at how the franchise system can improve in this area. One of the things that happened I think as a result of the last franchise review was the addition of a 90-day notification period when a franchisee wanted to sell their business, required a 90-day notification period to give co-bid firms an opportunity to take a look at that and potentially participate. And one of the things that could happen as part of this franchise review is to look at the question of what difference has that made? And is there a need or an opportunity to look further at that as part of the franchise review, or potentially outside the review process? Sometimes one of the things that happens in the review is we identify some opportunities for change, and that change really can't be handled through the franchise agreement itself, but it can be handled through city code or administrative rule.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And then I have one request. Just given the approximate range of increase that we're looking at, that's not insubstantial. And there are households that will be burdened by the accruing costs of this. And so for just my own understanding of where these costs are coming from, it would be really helpful to go back like 2 or 3 years, I don't know, 2021, 2022, 2023, and look at the total increase once you guys have the information available for this year. And then if possible, also breaking that down according to those subcategories that you had on the slide with fuel, wages, whatever else, so that we can really understand where those costs are coming from.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, we have our Neil, our economist, on the call as well, so he will surely put that together for us.
Yeah, Vice Chair Council. Thank you, Vice Chair Thompson, for that. You actually asked some questions that I was very interested in. I was curious about as well. I was wondering if you could possibly talk about your low-income rate assistance. Like, how does that actually work? And then I also had another question about you had said that there was a possible increase in wages, and I was just wondering if you could maybe discuss that as well.
Well, I can speak to the low-income program, and then I wonder if Neil might be able to tell us a little bit more about labor cost increases. So we just initiated a project to explore and then eventually propose a low-income qualifying discount for garbage and recycling costs for single-family residents. So at this point, it's just something that we're committed to exploring and proposing, and we don't know the scope of that discount or the magnitude. Neil, can you speak to the question about labor cost increases? Oh, you're muted. How do we address that?
I should be unmuted.
There we go.
Can you hear me now?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, so for the labor inflator, we take a look at both union contracts. So like Waste Management, they just put a new union contract in place. And like a lot of businesses, they face challenges. All the haulers face challenges with finding employees the last couple of years. And what we're seeing from both union contracts as well as just general cost of employment indices is a rather substantial increase in what businesses need to pay. So a portion of that increase is sort of grounded in what union contracts are. And the new union contracts tend to have a fairly large bump because they just renegotiated that for the first year. And then it's sort of a weighted average of the union contract as well as this sort of general cost of employment index, which sort of applies across the board to a lot of businesses. So it's a relatively substantial inflationary increase. It is applied to what they reported on their costs, and the haulers have over the years have done a very good job in sort of being relatively efficient and driving down their labor hours for the services that they provide. And one correction, that the 10% increase, that's actually the 18-month increase. I think on an annualized basis, it's about 7.6% or so.
Thanks for that. Do you have like a percentage point on those? I don't know if you are able to divulge that or if you know, but if you know if there's a percentage point on the labor increase bump, or do you know what that?
For the union contracts?
Yes.
I believe off the top of my head, it's about, I think for the first year, it's like 15%. Again, that's just sort of off the top of my head for that. And then the cost of sort of the employment cost index, that's probably about 6%. So if it wasn't for the union contracts, you'd probably be looking at something closer to 6%, not 10%.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate our haulers and the guys who take care of our sanitary needs in the city, and I feel that they should definitely be their labor should definitely be honored and respected, and I know you guys are gonna do the best you can to make sure that follows through for them.
When does this go to online testimony? Does that open up immediately after this? So we do have the public hearing portion right at the May 9th. Okay, so online testimony will open.
I think as soon as it's posted, it would be open.
Okay.
Right? So is this already posted? I'm sorry, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, the project is able to take testimony at any time. This one is not going through the MAP app, so the process is people will submit testimony either to staff or through the Planning Commission email that I forward to you all.
Okay.
The registration link for testifying at the May 9th meeting will be open on Thursday.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, any additional comments, questions from commissioners? We will have another opportunity to discuss at the May 9th meeting, and of course hear any public testimony at that time.
I do
Chair
have
Thompson.
one more thing on the topic of testimony. How has the public been alerted to the opportunity to provide testimony on this topic?
We don't. I don't believe the city, as a matter of course, does any widespread public notification for the process. It's just an annual rate review process. Perhaps unfortunately or fortunately, it's a process that doesn't have a wide scope of discretion. The city's code requires us to look at the costs of providing this essential service and adjust the fees to meet the target margin and cover the costs. And the city council is in fact required to do that under a code. So when we're in spaces like this talking about the costs, it's very helpful educationally for us to understand where the what concerns there might be about cost drivers, or for us to use this as a platform to communicate with stakeholders around where cost increases are emerging from. That give us maybe some long range ability to think about how to manage for those over time. But unfortunately, in the moment, we end up on this very defined track with a very defined, clear goal that says, okay, we have to raise the rates or lower them to meet the target required in city code. So I think in part for that reason, it's not typically seen as a highly stakeholder driven process. It's much more formulaic.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question.
Okay, thank you all for that presentation. We are going to take a 5-minute break. We're doing great on time, so let us reconvene at 10 after 6. Commission, coming back after a short break. The next item on the agenda is to continue the wonderful series of training that BPS staff has been providing us with as the newly formed Planning Commission. So we have Tom Armstrong, Ariel Kane, Sam Brookham, and Morgan Tracy. Please feel free to correct me if I've mispronounced, but welcome, and we're looking forward to the training this evening.
Great, thank you. I'm Tom Armstrong. I'm a supervising planner here at BPS, and I manage the Housing and Economic Policy team. And online is Sam Brookham and Ariel Kane, who are part of my team. And then with me tonight is Morgan Tracy, another planner, who will be talking a little bit later tonight about the zoning code changes that we've done in the recent past. Next one, please. So tonight, as part of this training, I was going to give you a high-level overview of the housing goals and policies that are in Chapter 5 of the Comprehensive Plan. And then we were going to provide some information about housing in Portland and recent housing production trends, and then talk about the housing needs analysis and the housing production strategy, which are two state-required documents that we do that will be coming to you later this year and into 2024. So I think you've seen this diagram before in a previous training. This gives it sort of the elements of the comprehensive plan. And just to highlight, we're going to talk tonight about the goals and policies that are in the plan, and then a little bit about the housing needs analysis and the buildable lands inventory, which we consider to be supporting documents or background documents to the comprehensive plan, but they are required by the state under Oregon's statewide planning laws, and they are recommended by the Planning Commission and adopted by ordinance by council as part of the comprehensive plan itself.
And we are not seeing the, okay, working on it. Sure.
Yeah, maybe go back one slide.
So we're just taking one moment to align the screen share for the presentation. There we go.
There we go.
Thank you.
So as I said, we'll talk a little bit about the goals and policies tonight, and then dig a little deeper into the supporting documents that will be coming before you later this year that eventually get adopted by council to be incorporated as an update to the comprehensive plan. So jumping into the goals and policies in Chapter 5, go ahead and go to the next one. So we have 5 high-level, broad goals that really address the spectrum of housing issues in terms of diversity, which really gets at supply, equitable access, addresses some of the affordability issues, healthy connected city, which you heard a little bit about last time, is really about location and where housing is located in Portland. Of course, affordable housing, and then getting into, and this sort of ventures over into some of the sustainability issues around high performance housing, energy efficiency, quality of housing. Next slide. You'll see in the comprehensive plan, we have bundled these policies to roughly correspond to each of the 5 goals. The first bundle, again, is about sort of housing choice, the diversity of the types of housing that we have in Portland. We have a goal in Policy 5.2 to capture at least 25% of the regional growth. We've been as high as 35% or 38% of the new units in the Portland metro region. Last year we dipped to 22% of new units. in the region. The we also base this off of the future forecasts from Metro and eventually now with new state legislations, the state will be preparing those forecasts. The most recent Metro forecast had Portland with about 29% of the future housing growth of the region. The state early preliminary state forecast had as much as 45% of the region. So, you know, we've been pretty successful, and you'll see some slides later about how much production we've had. So all of these are within the range of possibilities. Some of these other policies, especially like 5.6, the middle housing, really drive some of our zoning decisions and are the foundation, as you will learn later, about the residential infill project that really direct those future projects that we have. Next slide. There's a bundle of policies around housing access, and as I said, some of these address sort of what I would call little a affordability, which is affordability in general for people in Portland. This section also has sort of the suite of policies, of equity policies that begin to get at displacement risk and really sort of provide our guidance for how we analyze various zoning proposals to see who benefits and who's burdened by those changes. And yeah, go ahead. And one of the tools that we use that you will see, you know, starting back in 2012, we worked with Dr. Lisa Bates at Portland State to develop a displacement risk analysis or a vulnerability analysis, where we look at the demographic factors that make a household vulnerable to displacement, and this is really focused on residential. And what we're looking for and what you see in this map is areas that have a lot of alignment with these 4 factors, that being household income, housing cost burden, people of color, and education attainment, as in, you know, people without 4-year college degrees have sort of less opportunity to get a better job. What you were just talking about as part of the solid waste rates, you know, their ability to keep up with increasing housing costs are more limited. If you could, so here's a larger version of this map, and we can send out a link to our online tool where you can see it. But the areas in darker blue, the top 2, the blue and the darker blue, are the areas that we really consider to be most vulnerable in Portland. And those are the areas where we see those 4 or 5 factors really line up in concentrations. This is at a census tract level of analysis, and we've just updated this based on the most recent available data, and we try and keep this fresh so that when we go into a project in an area, say like Lentz, where we know there's a high degree of vulnerability, we're take a closer look or more consideration as to what the impacts of the proposed changes might be. We have a bundle of policies around location, and the key ones there are about access to opportunity and encouraging new development and opportunity areas. Next slide. I think you saw this complete neighborhoods map last session as part of the urban design look, and how we use this from a housing policy standpoint is that we really want to look at, when we're doing projects, look at encouraging more housing in high opportunity areas or more complete neighborhoods, the yellow areas, and the deeper red orange areas on the map. And then the flip side is, in the pink areas, the areas with lower completeness or lower opportunities, we want to encourage more infrastructure investment to sort of increase the completeness of those areas. We have a goal in the Portland plan that 80% of Portlanders will live in a complete neighborhood by 2035. About 2/3 of Portlanders live in a complete neighborhood today. About 75% of our recent housing production has been in complete neighborhoods, but we're not going to be able to grow our way to that 80%. We're going to have to make infrastructure investments and other changes to sort of increase the coverage of complete neighborhoods in Portland in order to meet that 80% goal. As I said, we have a suite of policies that deal with what I would call more the big A affordable housing, the regulated affordable housing. These come with the sort of requirements, contracts. They have the public funding either through the Portland Housing Bureau or Metro bonds or state funding that have long-term set-asides for housing. In policy 526, we actually set an affordable housing target, which was 10,000 new regulated affordable housing units by 2035. That's roughly 8% of the growth, which is, you'll see later, roughly 8% of our housing stock. So we were just trying to keep up with the growth. And so far,
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
We actually have a couple of questions now from commissioners.
If you could just wait for one more
Okay.
slide, and we'll finish this little
Yeah.
module on policies,
good.
and we'll stop for some questions, and then we can move on from there.
Okay. And Commissioner Alexander, you can go first when we get to that break. I know you've had your hand up.
So I'll just, with this, so far the Housing Bureau has produced about 4,800 units of affordable housing. We're roughly halfway through that 2035 time horizon. So, pretty good, but, we are sort of spending through the city and Metro bond funding. And so, the future is a little murky on our ability to continue that pace. 535, inclusionary housing, is something that you will hear a lot more about, and 537, mobile home parks. Again, these are both examples of policies that are in the comp plan that drove our projects and our decisions. And you'll hear about both of these a little later this evening. And then finally, we have one policy on homelessness. It's an interesting artifact of the time. In 2012 to 16, we were really thinking as homelessness as a sort of a different, separate, not a land use planning issue, but more of a service issue. We're now bringing that more into the land use planning realm, and the state is moving more towards providing rules and requirements on us to consider that. Again, you'll hear a little bit later about the shelter to housing code projects that address this continuum of housing. And then, we have the, other general policies that give us some direction around renter protections and healthy housing that help sort of reinforce some of our initiatives. So I'll pause there and see what kind of questions are about the general policy framework.
Go ahead, Commissioner Alexander. We can't. There we go.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we can now.
as you spoke about targeted populations living within completed neighborhoods, and as you talked about the 4,800 threshold, is there a distinction made between occupancy versus ownership in those units? I'm trying to get some sense of, I mean, whether people are in spaces that are rentals, whether there's an intentional movement towards ownership in communities where there's unrepresentation or underrepresentation around home ownership, and just what's being measured, I guess, over time is my question.
We have not. That's a good question, and to date we have not really gone that deeply in terms of looking at that access to opportunity and how it varies across either different demographics or different ownership versus rental. But it is something that we can dive into, especially as part of the upcoming housing needs analysis. To go deeper into those issues.
Is there follow-up, Commissioner Alexander?
By way, I'm not asking for a follow-up, but as this data continues to be massaged, it would be, I think, of value to begin to see if there are shifts. If we're measuring it, we can determine whether it's moving in one direction or another.
Yeah.
Okay, Commissioner Lang and then Commissioner Patel.
Thank you. How's affordable housing defined in the comp plan?
That's a good question. I think it is anything that is regulated, sort of has basically a contract agreement with the Housing Bureau that sets it aside. Usually those are at least 30-year contracts, and now under the inclusionary housing program, it's 99 years.
Okay.
So what might be considered permanently affordable, income restricted. Usually that income restriction is at 80% area median income and below, and we'll get into more of that in a little bit.
Okay.
At those income levels.
Thank you. The other question, and I was writing faster than I can spell. When you were talking about complete neighborhoods and you said you can't get there through growth alone, and you said something like infrastructure or something, what do you mean by how do you create a complete neighborhood? What are the tools that you have to work with to do something like that?
Sure. So, the factors that go in, it's a mix of sort of hard city infrastructure, like access to parks or access to transit. So in some ways, we work with our Bureau partners to fill in the gaps. And we've been doing a lot of those investments out in East Portland, both in terms of parks and access to transit. The other elements, especially the top two there, healthy food and commercial services, can fall on BPS through zoning and looking at areas that, such as what you'll hear later this year, the Lower Southeast Rising project, areas that may be underserved by commercial services, where we could go in and look at what are appropriate locations where we might expand commercial mixed-use zonings so that there can be more commercial space for shops and services that people can walk to or be close by and easily accessible.
Just wanted to, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Patricia Diefenhofer, just wanted to point out, the slide that we put back up, you can see the factors, that list of bullets are the things that, make for a complete neighborhood per our policy. So as Tom said, some of those things are, hard infrastructure that city provides, or, is provided through development, and some of those things are provided through development, like obviously grocery stores or shops and commercial services. But the role that planning plays is making sure that the zoning that there's appropriate zoning in locations to ensure, for example, that there's enough commercial, zoning to allow for those kinds of uses. So it's a combination of, having the right zoning and rules in place, and then hopefully encouraging the right kind of development and pairing that with cities' infrastructure investments to try to create more complete neighborhoods.
Thank you. And that's why I asked the question is trying to, what's our role in that process? And of course, whenever we look at these maps, at least my eyes go immediately to where I live, which is, which is really not very desirable in a lot of ways. And so how I'm thinking in my neighborhood, which is way out in East County, how do you bring those type of things in? I would love to be able to walk to a grocery store, but it's just not feasible at all. And I don't see how that's done, although I see some other things happening in that neighborhood, and I'm sure we'll have more discussions about those down the road. But it's interesting, and thank you for connecting the dots there, because that's where I was going with my brain too, is that's gonna kind of fall on us to look at more intensely to make those decisions then.
Right. And that also sort of drives where we choose our projects, our next area plan project, to try and fill in some of those gaps.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Patel and then Vice Chair Pouncil.
Thank you. I had two questions, but Commissioner Lange just had to ask the same question that I had about how complete neighborhoods is accomplished. So thanks for clarifying that. My other question was about how the map in a previous slide about the total vulnerability risk score. How often is the data to identify those areas updated?
So we just updated it. It had been a few years since, I believe it was 2018 when we last updated it. We want this to be a tool that not only our Bureau partners use, but the community can rely on. And so we've made a commitment to update this at least every 2 years. I mean, the demographic data doesn't change that quickly, but we do want to keep it fresh and have it be a valuable tool that people can rely on.
Thank you. And you might have already mentioned, but what are the factors that go into determining a vulnerability risk?
Yeah, so you can see the 5 factors here. There's one based on housing cost burden, which is a measure in the census data around how much households pay for their housing costs. And if you're paying more than 30% of your income, then you're considered a cost-burdened household. And so that's a sign of pressure and potentially being displaced because you can't keep up with those costs. We have a demographic factors there, not only with communities of color, but because of the equity policies at the city, really putting an emphasis or looking at where the Black and Indigenous people live in Portland as well. And then, as I was explaining earlier, a 4-year college, lacking a 4-year college degree in terms of education attainment, and how that unlocks employment opportunities at those higher income levels, and then just basic household income as well.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Pouncil.
Yeah, thank you for being here. I was curious about on the middle housing. Of course, we all want Portland to be beautiful and welcoming to everyone. But I'm curious if there's been any plan to keep those communities affordable, to keep gentrification basically at bay when you have these complete communities, because complete communities are great, so what is there a plan to or if there's been any thought into like how do we make sure that these costs for these communities don't rise?
Yeah, I think it's a multi-pronged strategy, and we'll get a little more deeper. It's more than middle housing. I think at the highest level, again, it's trying to, especially trying to drive a lot of the market rate, more expensive housing into the areas that are complete, and with that, especially the larger projects, come inclusionary housing. They have a segment that is required to be affordable. I think the other is to just create more complete neighborhoods, right? Create more of the nicer places for people to live, and to spread that out, and to spread that sort of demand out across the city. I think what you will see here in just a minute is that the central city and the inner neighborhoods that are more complete have seen most of the growth in the last 12 to 15 years, and that attraction is happening, and so that's where the inclusionary housing policy can provide some of that affordability to help maintain the connections in those neighborhoods. And yet at the same time, we need to be creating more of those nice neighborhoods.
Okay. And just one more question. I wasn't quite sure too. I'm so sorry that I'm kind of ignorant on this, but is there any type of like for like this inclusionary housing or middle income housing that either the city or the state is involved in, possibly being the planner or the builder, so that there is some type of like community control of rates to be more competitive with private?
Right. That is the what we call the regulated affordable housing that has funding from this. Usually the city or the state provides funding to typically a nonprofit developer, sometimes a for-profit developer. They get that funding in exchange for a contract or a promise to keep those units affordable at a certain income level over the long term. And increasingly, we originally started out at 30 years, and then it went up to 60 years. Now the standard seems to be 99 years, so that funding for those regulated units really, that's where those are the permanently affordable units, and that's how we can create. But that is only 8% of our housing stock.
Right.
We often refer to capital A affordable housing. That's sort of the regulated, what Tom was describing. It's got a term of duration that it's going to be regulated for, and it keeps it at a certain percent below median income levels, for sets rent levels below a median income level. And then there's sort of lowercase a affordable housing, which is housing that is competitively less expensive than other housing around it. So when you hear us talk generally about affordable housing, that might be the non-regulated pool versus sort of the capital A affordable housing. Just a slight distinction there. Back to your first question, I also thought it would be good to mention the project like the West Portland Town Center is a project where we're creating a center in a place, and as part of that project, bringing a lot of tools and experimental tools to address potential displacement pressures and gentrification sort of pressures as that area transforms and changes, to maintain some of that naturally occurring affordable housing, as well as increasing opportunities for lower cost housing and lower income households.
Maybe if I could just, Patricia Diefendorfer, just sort of sum up. I think what you're hearing is that increasingly we're looking for more and more tools, and that includes a wide range of things, and it's usually very multi-pronged. So, for example, some of it is actual public funding and financing of housing in order to get the regulated affordable housing that does not, it's the rents are stabilized and they stay at a certain level, right? For people of incomes like 80% of AMI or 60% of area median income. There's also using the zoning code to try to incentivize more affordable housing in the inclusionary housing. There's also, trying to protect naturally occurring, what Morgan called naturally occurring affordable housing, which is affordable housing that's not regulated, but that exists and it naturally is, has lower rents than market rates. And there's different strategies that we can use, and we are experimenting with, I think is a good way to put it, to try to protect and not, to try to protect those particular housing that exists in an area. So there's a number of different strategies, and over time, you're going to hear a lot more about this through the different housing initiatives that we're working on, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I see Ariel has their hand up. Would you like to go ahead, Ariel?
We can't hear
I don't know
you.
if they can hear us. They were going like
There was-
this at some point, maybe.
Okay. Okay.
I saw some of this and I was like, oh, I feel like they're communicating with each other and it doesn't involve us.
Maybe you can throw in the chat that we're.
Can you hear us at all? No?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
Okay, I think we take just a moment to see if we can get our remote participants back with us here.
In the background.
Oh, great. Oh, all right. Great.
Yep.
Can you all online hear us?
Yes.
Okay. Here we go.
Okay, let's continue. So we were just presenting some questions to staff regarding this section. I know we have more of the training to go, and so I actually printed my own and have all kinds of marked up because this section is especially important to me, but I'm not going to throw those at you now. Let's go ahead and proceed, if that's okay with the commission, to the next part of
Why
the
don't we
training,
do that?
which is still housing related.
You can send them to us, and we'll turn them back into a memo to the commission.
Perfect. Okay.
So I'm going to turn things over to Ariel, who's going to cover some highlights of recent housing trends.
Great. Hi. So I'm Ariel Kane. Can you all hear me just fine?
Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Great. Yeah. So I'm just going to cover a few things related to housing trends, a little bit about income and affordability, as well as recent permitting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that capital A affordable unit trend, as well as unregulated affordable trends here in Portland. So just to get started, I would love to show you the next slide about income. So we know housing preference is shaped by a lot of different things, household size, different lifestyle needs, but actual choice, location, and access is pretty significantly influenced by household income. So we have been looking at sort of identifying households that are more likely to struggle to meet the cost of housing based on their income, and it helps us sort of understand the current and future affordable housing needs. So we know Portland has been becoming increasingly wealthier, there's been a trend towards higher incomes, with about 40% of all households earning more than $100,000 per year, and 40% of households having incomes that are greater than 120% of the area median income, which is a regional determination for income based on household size. And for reference, 2022, the 100% rate for a family of four was $106,500. So on the flip side of that is we see that the number of lower income households are decreasing in Portland, and that's for a number of reasons. But we also are seeing that incomes are increasing for all racialized and ethnic groups from this 2010 to 2020 period. However, we're still seeing a disparity. Household income levels are rising the most significantly for white householders. Another factor that we're looking at is housing cost burden, which Tom had mentioned. So this is the 30% of your household income being spent on housing costs means you are cost burdened. And so we're also looking at it again by that income level, that affordability level based on the regional income by household size. So 80% is where we sort of determine that low income range. To date, 60,000 is about 80% for a one-person household, or that would be about double the minimum wage, and about 85,000 is 80% for a four-person household. So when we look at this table, we see that about 30% of all of Portland's households are cost burdened, and 31% of Portland's households are low income and cost burdened. So are below that 80% threshold. That's about 84,000 households that are needing more affordable housing to be able to live comfortably, safely, and in their neighborhood of choice. We're also looking at where do our households live. So overall, we're seeing a trend towards more households occupying multi-dwelling units, so those larger apartment buildings with 20 or more units at 21%, but we're still seeing a large, greater than half of our households that are occupying detached houses or single-family homes. In the last couple of years, we've been seeing trends of 75 to 80% of our production in that multi-dwelling sort of category. And so by 2035, we expect that these numbers will be sort of switched, 40% detached to about 60% multi-dwelling. We're also looking a little bit deeper and just seeing what the difference is between overall housing and then owner-occupied and renter-occupied. So we are seeing an increasing amount of renters in these larger apartment buildings, about 39%, up from 30% in 2010. And we're also seeing a decreasing share living in detached houses or in these multi-dwelling units, up to 4 units, with just 21% of all renters in these smaller unit dwellings. So the next couple of slides, I'll talk about permits. So this is just the housing production over the last several decades. So over the last 3 decades, we've been seeing that increasing share of permitting going towards multi-dwelling units. So from 58% in the decade leading up to 2003. And then in the 2014 to 2022 decade, we're seeing an increase up to 78%. In the last decade, we saw that single dwelling detached housing accounted for less than 10% of new development, which is a bit of a decrease from that 30% we were seeing in the decade up to 2003.
I'll just note there that trend, there's sort of two things going on there. One is over this last 30 years, we've really increased the zoning and the density within the city. And at the same time, we've been building out the detached single family land that is available. And so as those lots become harder and harder to find, you see that production declining over this time period.
Great, thanks, Tom. So when we sort of zoom out and we look at the total number of units that have been produced over the last 20 years, we're seeing, a pretty big dip in that 2009, 2012 Great Recession in the units permitted. And then after that, we start to see housing production sort of ramping back up, 3,000 to 6,000 units per year, with that all-time peak of about 7,000 units in 2017. You can also see sort of at the bottom of the graph, there's sort of a blue wave. That's the emergence of accessory dwelling units coming up in 2010. And then when we zoom back in a little bit, we're seeing, over the last 10 years, we're still seeing an increase. We're seeing from the 2020 sort of dip, we're starting to see more production come back up. Over the last 2 years, between 78 and 80% of our multi-dwelling permits accounted for the total within all of the permits. We're also looking at by pattern area, understanding where development and permitting is occurring. So there's been an increased share of development in that inner pattern area, jumping from the decade leading up to 2003, about 33% to almost 61%. And then we're seeing the share of units in Central City has been staying pretty consistent, while Western and Eastern areas, the share of permits in those areas are seeing a significant decline. The next couple of slides, we'll talk about that capital A regulated affordable housing units. We currently have about 24,000 units of regulated affordable housing. That's about 8% of our overall housing stock. Out of those 24,000 units, about 15,000 or 65% are in those areas considered vulnerable. So this is the same map that we saw before with the vulnerable risk areas. So these areas have higher renters, higher proportions of communities of color, populations without bachelor's degree, and households that have that income below 80% median family income. Additionally, you can kind of see the distribution of where regulated affordable housing has been occurring, and it's also occurring pretty significantly along or within 1,000 feet of high traffic roads, such as a highway, freeway, or other major arterials, such as 82nd Avenue or MLK. That's about 17,000 of our units, or 72%, are happening in those areas. We also have affordable housing in the pipeline. So we do have more affordable housing coming. So about 3,400 units, 1/3 of which should be deeply affordable to that lower income bracket of about 30% of the area median income. 38%, so also just about 1/3, are going to be family sized, sort of loosely defined, I believe, as 2 to 3 bedrooms per unit. Additionally, 24% will be permanently supportive housing available for currently houseless households. And then last but not least, the sort of little a unregulated affordable housing. So this is naturally occurring affordable housing. It's defined by the quality. So these aren't luxury apartments by age. They're older apartments, and that combined with other factors mean the rents are a little bit lower. So these kinds of units are generally smaller, but they range from rent from $850 to maybe $1,300 a month, based on our estimates. Out of all of the housing units that we have, that's the multifamily housing units that we talked about 17% were that regulated affordable. The rest, 83%, are sort of market rate unregulated. And then 53% of those we are estimating are NOAA, or naturally occurring affordable housing. And then when we take a look at where those are distributed by area, we see a large share is distributed within the inner market area. And then the middle and outer areas account for about 20%, and then the least amount of naturally occurring affordable housing out in the west area. Additionally, apartments, the multi-dwelling unit count accounts for about 75% of all of the naturally occurring affordable housing units, with townhouse or attached housing accounting for a very small portion of those housing units. And then I think we'll pause for more questions before passing on.
Can we go back one slide and just, so much of this, I have questions when we begin to look at shifting types of housing. I'm curious as to how we characterize, I live in Sellwood, and we'll have an old 80 or 90-year-old building, a home that's torn down and 8 units are developed. And I'm trying to figure out the math. When we talk about the emergence of townhomes or multi-units at the loss of a single dwelling, how do we factor that into the shift? Because I'm thinking we're looking at growth and the creation, but there's also a flip side, which is the loss of one of those types of housing.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, that is the trade-off. I think what we have seen, and especially in other communities and especially in California communities, that if you're not making that trade-off, if you're constraining the supply that is of housing that's available in your community, the prices are going to go up. And what may look like a single affordable detached dwelling today is not going to be affordable tomorrow unless you're expanding the overall supply of housing. And so we explored this, and you'll learn a little bit more about the residential infill. We explored those types of questions, and we've been sort of more biased towards we want to see more housing in our community. It helps to keep units relatively affordable. It helps achieve our carbon reduction goals, especially when those units are being built near transit or in our complete communities where you can walk to shops and services. So there's a number of different sort of goals, values that are embedded in that. But as a community, we have been more about trying to expand that supply, and one of those trade-offs is the loss of those lower cost single dwellings.
Yeah, and I'm going to let you move on. And this is a tremendous learning opportunity for me, but I come to it as an activist. And as I look at this particular slide, one of the things that I'm concerned about is, not concerned, but reacting to or triggered by, is that a significant disproportion of the housing that's being developed in inner versus outer. The assumption can be, well, we're creating these communities for people who have been underserved, but the reality is, if we look at the population shifts over the last decade, those people are not there now. They are in the outer portion where we're seeing a disproportionately low end. So I know there's no easy answer to this, but again, as a community guy, it just triggers me.
Yeah.
We haven't figured out how to break the code between investment and displacement. So I just needed to say that, or else I was going to jump up and scream.
No, you are correct. We're trying with things like inclusionary housing that gets some margin back. All of these large new projects have to pay what's called a construction excise tax that goes into an affordable housing fund. So we're trying to do it with the tools that we have, and sometimes it's not up to us. Like inclusionary housing comes with a lot of state sidebars that we have to play with. So it's not all totally up to the city to set that policy. So, but
Fully
you're right.
understand. It's just the stark reality of unintended consequences to some of this being a part of what we live with. Thank you.
I just also wanted to add, Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. There's just something to also consider in that one single dwelling home that may be replaced by 8 dwelling units, for example. If that home was, occupied by the person who owned it, then at least the one sort of maybe consolation is that person was not involuntarily displaced, but rather made the choice to sell their home, and that resulted in the redevelopment of that site that allowed for more units. And then there's again, the trade-off is like, well, now there's 8 homes for people to live in versus 1. So I just wanted to kind of lay that out too, that there's there's people who make the choice to leave a place, and then there's the forces where people maybe didn't have a choice, and they had, there were pressures and they could not hold on to their place of residence. But I just wanted to kind of throw that into the mix of the discussion as well.
And it has a tremendous bearing on the shifts. Doesn't have the same impact on rental markets though, which is where we saw a significant loss of rental properties within inner areas, particularly Northeast. But anyway, I'll let that go.
Thank you for raising that, Commissioner Alexander. I did want to just state that the Portland Housing Bureau Northeast program is something that the organization I work for has participated in. I think that's a great example of trying to address some of these complicated intersections right between displacement and opportunity in inner neighborhoods. But it is a complicated issue. I want to offer for Commissioner Patel. You've had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks, and Ariel, thank you for the presentation. The data is very informative. And this question might be beyond the purposes of this presentation, but I'm wondering whether we have any data on the average permit review time from application to building permit approval by unit type.
We don't have that as part of this presentation.
Of course, but
that is an issue. We can get you some of that data. There's various task force working on that to speed things along. So we'll get you some data to that.
Thanks.
Vice Chair Thompson.
I was wondering about the drop off in ADU counts from, I don't know when it was, roughly like 2017 or 2018, and what you think is driving that. And then I also wanted to clarify if ADUs, if that includes all accessory dwelling units or only accessory dwelling units that have agreed to the constraints of the SDC waiver and are guaranteed to not be used as short-term rentals.
Yeah, I think you hit on why we saw that little dip, was that so starting in 2011-12, we started offering the SDC waiver for ADUs. One more. So 2010 is when ADUs, we did some changes to the zoning code that clarified what you could do there and made it easier to build an ADU, made it clearer under the code where an ADU fell. And then we started offering an SDC waiver. But the dip that you see sort of starting in 2019 was when we started requiring in order to qualify for the SDC waiver, you had to agree not to be a short-term rental for 10 years. And so we saw a little dip in the ADU production with that. And we've done other changes, as you'll hear about in the residential infill project, that allow you to build more ADUs on your site. So hopefully we'll see that increase here over the next couple of years.
I'm not seeing additional questions, so we can proceed to the next section. Thank you.
Okay. So this is a little bit about what's coming. The housing needs analysis and the housing production strategy. Next one. So the housing needs analysis, we will bury you in more numbers. Tonight was just a taste of what we've got. But basically, ultimately, in the housing needs analysis under statewide planning goal 10, the state requires us to show that we have enough room, enough development capacity to accommodate 20 years of housing growth. And that's the basic exercise that we are going to go through. Starting in 2019 and even up to today's legislature, they're changing these requirements, upping these requirements for cities to be more intentional about their housing planning. And so starting with this year, we're gonna be updating this analysis every 6 years, and we're gonna have a mid 3-year progress report to the state as well to check on how we're doing. So the HNA, the housing needs analysis, includes a community profile, some of the stuff that you just saw, an inventory of sort of what our housing stock is, what kind of permits have we been seeing lately, and then we look at a housing forecast. What is going to be the future demand in Portland? We get a lot of that as I said, we get a lot of that information, and what we're building the current HNA on is a metro forecast that allocates a certain amount of the regional growth to Portland. And so we're figuring out where that goes in Portland and what that might look like in a number of different ways. And then at the same time, we do what's called a buildable land inventory, or a BLI, which is the supply side or the capacity. Where are the vacant land? Where is the lower value land that allows residential development? What is that likely to develop as? Is it an 8-unit townhome project, or is it a 5-story, 60-unit apartment building? And so we go through that analysis to figure out how much room do we have to grow. And then we do sort of a capacity analysis or a reconciliation to look at what do we think the demand is going to be, what do we have room to grow, and where are the gaps? And those gaps are really drive our future actions. Next slide, please. And so what also is new as part of this is the state is now requiring a housing production strategy, which is basically a 5-year action plan. So once we've identified those gaps, what are we going to do about it? What are our best efforts to, and that is a wide range of tools, many of which we're already doing, but could we do them better? And which new policies, new programs do we need to add? And so here's a little graphic that just sort of shows how this process flows. That we look at our existing conditions. One thing that I like to think about is 2/3 of the housing units that are going to be here in 2045 are already on the ground today, and are part of that housing stock that is going to be here in 2045, and that only about 1/3 of that housing is going to be new housing. And so, a lot of what we have today will drive what tomorrow looks like. And then we'll we'll go through the need and look at the supply, and really look at where that needed housing, what those gaps are. And then, and we have to do, the state requires that we do all of that housing capacity analysis by December of 2023. That the council needs to adopt that by December of 2023. So we'll bring all of this to you in a more formal way starting in September. And then after that, we will get into the action plan, the housing production strategy. We have another year under the state rules to create that housing production strategy. So into 2024, we'll start looking at that action plan and how we can do better to promote this housing. So I'm going to turn things over now to Sam Brookham, another economic planner on my team, to give you all a little more about the forecast and the buildable land inventory. Are you there, Sam?
Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Tom said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the housing forecast, which again is sort of the demand or needs side of the equation, and then the BLI, which is really the supply, how much land do we have. So we flick to the next slide. What I'm going to focus on and what is going to be the focus of many of the slides that I'm presenting here is actually the 2015 Growth Scenarios Report, which is part of the 2035 Comprehensive Plan. The Growth Scenarios Report outlined a need or a demand for 123,000 additional housing units between 2010 and 2035. So once again, as Tom mentioned, that's a third of the housing units that are expected at that point. 2/3 remain, or at least exist today. We don't actually expect a huge amount of change with the new HNA or BLI in terms of where those housing units really fall geographically. And so when I say that, what we're really talking about is centers and corridors. We're talking about central city, complete neighborhoods, as we've talked about a little bit, and then the housing types. So 75% of the new development of those 123,000 additional housing units are actually expected to take place in centers and corridors. Those centers and corridors are expected to be ready now to accommodate that growth. The central city, on a similar note, is expected to accommodate 30% of that future growth. That's deemed to be the most cost-effective, efficient way to provide the greatest level of service to the greatest number of Portlanders. And then for complete neighborhoods, we're expecting 77% of those 123,000 units to take place in complete neighborhoods. Tom mentioned earlier that 80% goal as part of the 2035 comp plan. Just wanted to reiterate that here because it's close to that 77% here, and we're actually going to be redoing or updating the analysis as part of this HNA, and hopefully we'll get closer to that 80%. On the housing, one last thing on that piece. The housing types, 80% in multi-dwelling buildings. That's really talking about those 5+ unit buildings. And the residential infill project, which allows for more of those middle housing types, particularly in single families or single dwelling zones, could impact that. But again, we're not expecting it to be a huge change overall. So of those 123,000 additional households in that 25-year period through 2035, that equates to about 5,000 units per year. And you can see here, we're actually not doing too bad. We're tracking pretty well with that forecast. And as a reminder, that time period included the Great Recession and more recently the pandemic. So Doing pretty well in that regard, but we are going to be updating that planning year horizon to 2045, so extending it another 10 years and updating those numbers accordingly. So I'm going to switch gears to the supply side with the buildable land inventory, or the BLI. And I wanted to provide a quick overview for those who aren't familiar with it. The BLI is an assessment of the development capacity of the land within the city to accommodate forecasted housing and employment needs through the year 2045. Development capacity is defined as the likely number of new dwelling units that can be accommodated under the existing zoning. And so with this BLI, what we're doing is calculating an estimate of the development potential that's possible under current plans and zoning after we consider infrastructure and physical constraints and a range of other constraints. One of the things that's quite different about the BLI that we're underway with now versus the one that was conducted last in 2016 is that the 2016 BLI used a floor area ratio based capacity model that really just identified vacant and redevelopment capacity through a function of underutilization of allowable FAR by zone. So essentially looking at it from a zoning and development entitlement perspective. What we're doing here, and I'll get into the methodology in a couple of slides time, is applying more of a market-based development lens that really identifies development feasibility and at what scales. So we're getting a more market realistic, in theory, realistic depiction of development capacity throughout the city based on a range of inputs. So going just quickly back to the growth scenarios analysis that was done again in 2015, that 123,000 additional housing units is far surpassed by the overall capacity. So basically, Portland currently has or was deemed to have more than enough development capacity to accommodate future residential growth. We don't expect that to change with this, based on the preliminary BLI and forecast numbers that we've been coming up with. And again, the overall capacity there that was conducted in 2015 had 70% in centers and corridors and only 11% in single dwelling zones. What the excess capacity does is creates a pretty significant opportunity for us to make choices about where to focus or prioritize that residential growth. And I believe Morgan's going to talk in a little bit about a number of projects that have been done to help, and are continuing, that will help us maintain that capacity, even as we have seen pretty significant development activity over the past decade. These two diagrams, the one on the right is a little easier to kind of decipher in terms of overall density and capacity, but it really shows the distribution that's in the 2035 comprehensive plan in terms of overall capacity. We have a significant concentration in Central City and the inner neighborhoods, and then in major centers like St. John's and Gateway, and along major corridors like Barber Boulevard and 82nd. And so this, I promised that I'd go back to the redevelopment feasibility or the methodology around our new BLI model, and this is what this slide is focusing on. There are really 5 key steps to how we're undertaking this BLI. The first is just simply cataloging all of our vacant land, regardless of kind of development potential. That comes later. The second step is the brand new piece to this. And by redevelopment feasibility analysis, what I really mean is a kind of taking a pro forma feasibility approach to determine development feasibility as a developer would look at it. So what BPS worked with Echo Northwest to develop a pro forma analysis and a series of housing prototypes. There are 15 housing prototypes ranging from single dwelling detached to middle housing, like your townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, and then apartments, a range of different apartment prototypes, ranging from your sort of 3-story wood frame walk-up apartments to your more central city-oriented tower. And this pro forma analysis is actually embedded in the BLI model. What it does is calculates a residual land value. And a residual land value is otherwise known as a land budget. It's the amount of money that a developer could conceivably spend on land for a development, while still being able to hit all of the kind of target metrics that are needed to make that development viable. So what the BLI does is look at any site throughout the city where land values for any given prototype, where those land values are less than the residual land value or that land budget. Those sites are considered economically viable, and then we apply the unit capacity from the densest economically viable prototype. So a little complicated, but essentially we're basically looking at, you know, what's feasible and how many units can that theoretical development provide on any given site. Between those two steps, the vacant piece and the redevelopment piece, we get this, you know, the gross development capacity. How much stuff can we get built in theory if nothing else exists on that site, if no other constraints exist, if no other buildings exist? And then that takes us to step 4, where we do look at those development constraints. In adding in some of the recent development, we are recognizing that new development is unlikely to redevelop again in the next 20, 25 years because it's much more high value. It's harder to make pencil. It's probably not going anywhere. And we get our net new housing development that's based on zoning, building heights, floor area ratios, and the likely utilization of those floor area ratios based on market trends, unit sizes, and a range of other inputs. So I want to stop there. There's probably going to be questions I recognize about the methodology here, but hopefully that gives a pretty hopefully clearer overview of what we're doing. And I'll pass it back to Tom. I believe we've got next steps coming up, and we can pause there for questions.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about the inventory. Did the vacant land include industrial parks, open spaces, sort of areas where we wouldn't target or anticipate development? And did it also include older structure areas? I heard mention of it excluded projects that are 20 years or younger. So I was wondering if it included areas such as Old Town or some of our neighborhoods that have significant older building stock that could be redeveloped into new housing capacity.
So what went into it, there are a couple of components there that you talked about. We excluded parks and open space and most publicly owned land like schools. We would include land like stuff that's owned by the Port of Portland or the Home Forward. The BLI, we do both sides, right? We look at the employment side and the housing side at the same time, and we'll bring to you in a couple of meetings the employment side of things, because we're updating that analysis as well. So we look at both sides. We you know, in particular the industrial land, we don't allow housing on that, and so that's excluded from this analysis. But for the mixed use areas, we take a big chunk. I think it's about 60% of that building capacity we sort of typically is residential, so we'll put it in that residential supply, and some of it is used for parking, so that just goes into the ether, and then 15% or so goes into the commercial employment side of the ledger, to try and you know, look at the capacity in that way, spread between those two types. And was there another factor in
yeah,
there?
in terms
Oh,
of
the older buildings.
and,
Yeah.
and
So
also I'm wondering about, you know, areas that might currently be utilized for car dealerships or
Yeah.
something that someone could argue is underutilized, right?
Yeah.
But technically isn't vacant.
And-
So how do those get considered into the inventory for future redevelopment potential?
right, and that's what Sam was explaining, that this feasibility analysis, like say for a townhouse, right, that, you know, a developer can afford to pay, say, $80 a square foot for a plot of land and still expect to make money in building and so we go out and we look using the assessor data, where are there low value, similar to the example that Commissioner Alexander brought up, where are the small single-family homes of poor quality, low value in terms of the assessor data, that a developer might buy and be able to turn a profit on a development. And when we find one of those properties, that goes in the bucket, the buildable land inventory. Stuff like car dealerships on 82nd Avenue, they don't have a lot of improvement value. They're just land, and so those get sucked up into the analysis as well. So it really is, if you look around and look at the older, lower value properties that may have a single story where you can do 5 stories, they may be a small building, those are the types of things that get picked up in this buildable land inventory.
Okay, thank you. And then on the timing, I heard that there's the new 5-year requirement, right, from the state for the housing production strategy. Since we have our plan through 2035, will that be a 2035 to 2040 as our first 5-year, or what will be the time frame for that first 5-year production strategy?
We're bumping out the time frame to 2045,
Okay.
to sort of catch up, and that's what we have our forecast from Metro on. And then the state, it's a 6-year. It's a rolling
Okay.
6-year. From there, we'll just be bumping it out. Now, the forecasts, they like to do 5-year increments. There's some crossover to some of the transportation planning that has to go on. So we get into these weird, is it 20 years? Is it 25 years? But so we will be bumping out that planning horizon year. And then from going forward, we're going to keep it fresh to see how we're doing.
Okay, thank you. Vice Chair Thompson?
Thank you. I had a similar question about the feasibility analysis and some of the different prototypes, and was wondering if there was any intersection or coordination with the discussions that are happening around downtown office buildings with the recent council decision about SDC waivers and lesser seismic improvements, which admittedly there are still many, many hurdles left to convert those buildings into housing. But I'm just curious if this is an opportunity to make those explorations more real, or if that's something that was looked at as part of this.
We haven't looked at that from our planning side of things, and as part of this analysis, we really haven't looked at that for a couple of reasons. One is we have a lot of capacity already in the central city to grow. Our zoning permits it, so there's no zoning barrier to those conversions. so that begins to get out of the realm of sort of BPS policy and more towards Prosper Portland and others to sort of make that. Where it will come up is probably as part of the housing production strategy and highlight that opportunity. But that conversion is really sort of more for other goals around activating the downtown and reinventing or reactivation or bringing people back downtown and to certain parts, right? We have a lot of housing in the West End. We're starting to see housing in Lloyd Center. So those are more strategic opportunities that are a little bit of a finer detail than what we get into through this analysis.
Okay, that makes sense. But it is true that these would presumably be major renovations and that there would be potential non-conforming situations where there would be zoning code requirements that would need to be fulfilled by that major renovation. And I'm just curious if that has been explored at all.
I can speak to that. Patricia Diefendorfer for the record. I think there's a couple of different things going on here. There's what Tom is expressing is that for purposes of the housing needs assessment, the zoning capacity, we have significant zoning capacity, and so there isn't necessarily the need to, parse out what the building conversion, the office to housing conversion. That doesn't mean that it isn't going to be found as a strategy in the housing production strategy, right? And so to your point, there are building code perhaps constraints. There are less zoning code constraints to the conversion. There are some building code constraints that have been identified, like the seismic, but as you noted, that's, there's still hurdles. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm just trying to, the non-conforming or the major remodel. So certain things are triggered, right? Certain code requirements to make improvements to bring properties more into conformance, so non-conforming requirements with major remodels. That is something that we are looking at. Circling back to conversation earlier about the development survey that was done and the identification of a number of different potential code amendments and how much they will or will not kind of, play a role in facilitating housing production. And that has been something that we have kind of identified as a particular issue when it comes to the conversions. So we're exploring right now from that survey what things might truly be pursued as part of future code amendments. And that is definitely one we're looking at. And also the housing production strategy will probably, where the HNA may be a little silent on that, the housing production strategy will identify that as an action.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I don't know how we're doing on time. I have one more question, but I'm happy to go to others as well.
I think we're doing okay. Yeah.
And I don't know how much of a question this is. It's just kind of an observation that we're showing like the housing production targets and goals over time from, I don't know when it began, early 2000s, out to 2035. And then we've got like the dotted line that's roughly tracking, and it's like, we're doing pretty good. But it just, that tells such a different story from observation and what is actually happening on the ground. And we're in this housing crisis. So is it an affordability question? And that goes back to the discussion about more units, alleviate affordability issues. And so probably very difficult question to answer succinctly, but if you want to take a pass.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's sort of exactly what we're sort of looking at. Like, wow, we're meeting our forecast, but it isn't enough. And one of the new sort of factors that the state will be building into their forecasts is this idea of underbuilding, that even our past forecasts aren't that accurate, and they're not accounting for that pent-up household demand that is out there. So if you think about what we're seeing is like, maybe you have a house and it's full of 4 roommates, right? But they would much prefer to be in their own individual 1-bedroom or studio apartment. And so as soon as we build a little, where we had 1 household, we now have 4 households, and they've sucked up all of that new housing And so we're still in that tight market. We still have increasing rents. And so I think, and what we're going to get into, and I think, even though we have lots of zoning capacity, we still need to do more. And that's what we're going to explore through the housing production strategy is we're not doing enough because clearly it's not playing out in the marketplace. And so how can we produce more, not just zone for more housing, but how can we produce more of that housing?
Vice Chair Pouncil?
Yeah, I just another inquiry about like kind of stabilizing cost and affordability. I mean, has there been any investigation into how to make I don't know, I guess the developers pay into some type of affordability account to help with the state or with the city to build affordable housing, and also to I don't think that the market is going to really its goal is not to make necessarily things affordable. Everyone wants to make more money. So, is there any tools or anything in place that could, or if there's been any investigation of any tools that could be in place to not necessarily be competitive, but actually maybe, help bring the price of housing down to either it be subsidized by the city or the state, so that, these properties could be competitive, and help stabilize, because it seems as though that the more housing we build, the more people that come, and developers just can charge more rent because of the demand. So,
yeah, I mean, I think it really does start with that demand and sort of absorbing that demand, right? So that if we build, building new market rate housing is expensive. It's expensive to build. The construction costs, and there'll be some studies coming out from the Housing Bureau later this summer around sort of comparing Portland to Seattle or Denver and how those construction costs are largely the same, right? A 2x4 costs the same here as Seattle. And so, building new housing is expensive. But we also, and we'll show you in the housing needs analysis, we're also growing a lot of high income households in Portland. And so the more of that new housing, that new market rate housing that we build that can absorb those new households coming to Portland, it can relieve the pressure on the existing households. So that if again, for people looking around and they can't find an apartment to rent along Division, they're going to go 2 blocks over and rent that house and probably outprice a family, 4 incomes versus 1, 2.5 incomes kind of thing. So there is some there's some market at play there that we just need to build more housing, even if it's expensive housing. At the same time, we do have tools like inclusionary housing and the construction excise tax where we can extract a little benefit out of that market rate housing. Some of the other tools were constrained by state laws, right? The state law prohibits us from doing rent control. It constrains us on how much and what kind of projects are subjected to inclusionary housing. And so then we have to do other things like going out, we've seen Portlanders come out heavy and support a city bond for affordable housing, and then a couple of years later, a metro regional bond for affordable housing that can begin to produce some of those units. We've also had a whole different side of policy initiatives through the Housing Bureau around tenant protections. And what landlords, there's a state cap on rent increases. There's various sort of fair housing and eviction protections that begin to help stabilize. But we are a West Coast city, and we are facing all of these economic pressures of increasing costs and that are a result of increasing demand.
Thank you. We have one more portion in the training, correct? Okay, let's proceed to that. Thanks so much.
Just real quick, and then I'll turn things over to Morgan for our history here. Next steps, one more. So as we said, the takeaways are, on a very high level, we expect to continue to have plenty of zone development capacity at that very high level. But, as some of these questions tonight, we need to dig into some of the details. And we know we have a challenge around family size units and affordable housing. We didn't really get into, but there's lots of data around the need for accessible or visitable housing for disabled people. We know we have an aging population that we need to plan for. And as we were just talking about, we need to look at, what we're doing to stabilize cost burden households, and what else can we bring to the table to continue to address our most vulnerable Portlanders. And then, where, as we said before, we can be more strategic about our zoning tools and our infrastructure investments in increasing housing choices in these high opportunity complete neighborhoods that can really make a difference. Next one, please. So just again, we're going to have a discussion draft for the HNA here in June, and we'll start to take some public comment on that. We'll consider that, and we'll publish a proposed draft in August and bring that to you with public testimony in September for your deliberation and recommendation. And then that'll go to council for adoption. And then in 2024, we'll dig into the housing production strategy. Why don't we leave it there? And
we've got about 17 minutes left, and I've got about 24 slides to cover. So
we can hit some highlights.
All right. Oh. Luckily, it's not data heavy.
You just
More pictures, maps.
Pictures, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, 1 second.
I think by way of introduction, what we wanted to cover here is just give you an idea of what's come before. We have been working on this housing issue. We have been looking at increasing densities and increasing bonuses for affordable housing projects, increasing our housing capacity. And so we just wanted to give an overview of what we've really been doing for the last 7-8 years.
Yeah, not sitting idle by any means. Just to kind of speed things along here a little bit, I'm Morgan Tracy, a senior planner with the Bureau on the code development team. This is just a bit of a retrospective of these past projects that we've been working on to advance our housing goals. So over the past 7 years, the Bureau has undertaken a number of legislative projects to respond to the city's growing housing need from a variety of different angles. From early actions like inclusionary housing, which went into effect in February 2017, to the adoption of the comp plan, which establishes new goals for increased housing diversity, affordability, and access, the things Tom was talking about. And to more recently completed projects like the residential infill project. These housing initiative projects collectively retooled each of our base zones where housing is allowed, created new provisions to protect lower income housing options, and enabled more transitional housing to be created. Before we dive into these projects, I just wanted to give a little context to set the table a little bit. So when we're talking about housing, the term covers a broad spectrum of need, from solutions to address our houseless population, subsidized affordable housing, to market rate housing. Zoning is an important tool to steer growth to areas that are well served with infrastructure and near jobs and services, while also ensuring environmentally significant areas are protected and hazard areas are avoided. How that housing gets delivered requires other tools and actors. Shelters and transitional housing are funded by either government agencies or nonprofit organizations. Non-market housing in the middle can be a public-private partnership using incentives, fee waivers, inclusionary housing requirements, and cost sharing. Market rate housing on the left is built by for-profit builders and developers. So we were talking a little bit about this in our previous discussion. But when we're crafting our zoning rules, it's important to recognize these differences and needs and create the zoning tools to respond to that differently. We also talked a little bit about our centers and corridors growth strategy. So the 2035 comp plan considered several growth scenarios and opted for the centers and corridors strategy to optimize performance against a number of performance measures like carbon reduction, housing choice, and efficient infrastructure investment. The result is that of the 123,000 or so additional households anticipated by 2035, about a third will be concentrated in the central city, half will be in centers like Woodstock, West Portland, St. John's, and along connecting corridors like Sandy, Foster, and Hawthorne, with the remaining 20% distributed across neighborhoods like Tabor, Hillsdale, and Concordia. So this slide shows how that growth strategy translates into our zoning generally. So centers and corridors are comprised of a mix of multi-dwelling zones, which are the blue patches on the map, and commercial mixed-use zones, which are red, with the neighborhoods largely comprised of those yellow areas, the single-dwelling zoned yellow areas. To add a little more perspective to that, what the comp plan is saying is that 80% of the growth is projected for about 15% of the city's land area, while 20% is spread across 43% of the city's land area. So those are really, the centers and corridors areas are areas of really dynamic and expansive growth with a less pronounced growth in the single dwelling zones. So we'll cover the projects starting from the central city and moving out to the centers and corridors, then to the neighborhoods, and then follow those by the projects that make refinements across all these areas. So the central city accounts for about 30% of housing growth and about 3% of the city's land area. Central City 2035 provided lots of additional capacity for high density multifamily housing in the best served parts of the city. The project streamlined the FAR and bonus transfer system, eliminating many options in order to prioritize affordable housing. To increase capacity, increased floor area ratios and density and height in many areas of the central city, and to ensure efficient utilization of sparse land, minimum density requirements were also applied across central city. The project simplified zoning patterns in the downtown by changing areas of residential zones to central commercial, which are shown in red on the map on the left, which allows for greater flexibility of residential and commercial mixed-use developments. The map on the right shows several key redevelopment opportunity sites that now include a master plan requirement to address circulation, pedestrian realm, open space layout, infrastructure capacity, and building massing more comprehensively when those opportunity sites develop. Central City 2035 reduced the previous menu of floor area bonuses from 19 different options to 4, with the focus on providing affordable units. And the other 3 bonuses are only available in certain parts of the central city, like Riverfront, Industrial, and South Waterfront. The other major component of the central city plan was the unlimited transfer of FAR from sites within the central city to other sites. In addition, the project allowed for taller heights in some more difficult to develop areas along the waterfront or bridgeheads, or to support infrastructure investments like the transit mall, or where existing FARs exceeded previously allowed height limits. The height bonuses are tied to FAR bonuses to, again, further incent the affordable construction of more affordable housing. Our next project, commercial mixed-use zones, replaced our commercial-based zones, which had not been intentionally designed for mixed commercial and residential uses. They were primarily focused on commercial-type development. New design features were added to improve the compatibility of development and its relationship with adjacent lower intensity zones. A new system of height and floor area bonuses was added that focus on affordable housing and commercial space. enticing more public plazas, and the use of low-carbon, high-performance building materials. To further support the centers and corridors policies, the Main Street Overlay Zone was also created in order to further enhance and activate the pedestrian realm. So the images on the left show a comparison between the prior commercial zoning and the new mixed-use building form requirements. And these rules were in response to what we saw was an evolution of larger and larger developments that tended to maximize the building envelopes and created blank wall gaps in the pedestrian realm. The new rules increase the amount of active uses on the ground floor and require more building modulation, step downs to residential zones, and also require more amenities for residents, like communal areas or outdoor space. Moving into the multi-dwelling zones, Better Housing by Design retooled those zones by replacing dwelling unit density with floor area allowances to increase the diversity and type of housing around centers and corridors. So essentially, where there was a density requirement of 1 unit per 1,000 square feet of site area per particular zone, that is now just replaced with a maximum floor to area ratio, and there's no unit cap. So the density is only capped by the amount of floor space that's created. This allows for more, smaller, and less expensive units. The project improved building and site design standards to improve compatibility and promote walkability. It added new options to create needed street connections in East Portland and incorporated ways to preserve more trees and green space and reduce heat island effects. These images show how the new zones are no longer based on how many units are allowed based on the site size, but instead how they're tied to floor area ratio maximums. From the smaller scale RM1 to large scale RM4, each zone also offers bonus FAR and height for affordable housing or larger 3-bedroom units or accessibility features. And this image shows how the different multi-dwelling zones allow for a gradual transition between busy corridors and single-dwelling neighborhoods. Another innovation with this project was the allowance for small commercial uses in these zones when located along major corridors. A number of provisions that were added to the mixed-use zones were also included for multi-dwelling developments, such as building articulation and outdoor space for residents. We're screaming along. This is great. You keeping up? The last base zone frontier, single-dwelling zones, the residential infill project formulated a dual proposition. On the one hand, it established new building size limits that reduced the size of homes that could be built by 1/2 to 2/3 their previous size. On the other hand, new types of middle housing were introduced so that a mix of unit types and sizes could be made available in more parts of the city, except about 1/10 of the single-dwelling lots that have environmental or land hazard constraints. The new floor area limits were added to both cap the size of new structures and reduce the incentive to demolish existing homes, while creating more incentives to produce middle housing. New visitability standards were also created for sites with 3 or more units to provide greater accessibility for people with disabilities. And the second part of the residential infill project, or RIP2 as we call it, added cottage clusters and an expedited process to divide middle housing units so that they are each on their own piece of property through a middle housing land division. So this map shows the areas affected by RIP Part 1, which is the areas in yellow, and RIP Part 2, and together that comprises about 150,000 lots. And this slide is a good summary for the expansion of housing types allowed in single-dwelling zones. The top row shows what was allowed before RIP, so basically a house with an ADU, or a corner lot duplex. After RIP, we had duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, more ADU options, and an affordable option for a sixplex, so more units allowed, larger FARs allowed to encourage that. RIP 2 came and added attached houses, cottage clusters. The Planning Commission added a detached duplex option in the middle of deliberations. And we also created another form of affordable sixplexes in the form of townhouses. So these more side-by-side unit construction to respond to feedback we'd received from our nonprofit builders. This image shows how the housing type diversity may be realized through incremental and scale compatible infill on a typical single dwelling block. So here you can see basement ADUs and smaller homes and duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, in addition to family sized affordable plexes, coexisting happily with existing homes on the block. And now moving to projects that sort of address topic specific but are more broad across areas of the city. The manufactured dwelling park project addresses manufactured housing, which plays a small but important role in providing lower cost, market rate, affordable housing. It's often the housing of last resort for households that are struggling to cope with rising housing costs. At the same time, it can be the first choice of housing for low-income households, especially families. So this project consolidated the existing manufactured dwelling parks into one new base zone and created consistent land use regulations that address the unique nature of manufactured dwelling parks in terms of density, access, setbacks, and landscaping requirements. The map here shows the manufactured dwelling parks in yellow in relationship to the economic vulnerability analysis and illustrates one way we use the economic vulnerability analysis tools that Tom described. You can see there's close correlation between the manufactured dwelling park location and economic vulnerability, underscoring the need for added protections for those locations. The new MDP base zone provides 57 sites additional protection from redevelopment, representing about 3,000 units. Moving further into the housing continuum, the shelter to housing continuum projects were in response to identified challenges applying traditional zoning codes to non-traditional forms of housing. So Tom mentioned the policy in our the one policy in our comp plan, which reflected sort of a different position or response from our zoning code to the houseless situation. So while the code previously allowed for temporary uses and group congregate living, rules for other types of housing and shelter were not so clear. In order to facilitate the siting of homeless shelters, remove barriers, and provide more options for more types of shelter arrangements, this project clarified and expanded where and when transitional housing would be allowed. It accomplished this by making it easier to site homeless shelters and associated services, creating a new community service called Outdoor Shelter, which is important because until the amendments were adopted, outdoor shelters required specific code exemptions from the City Council one at a time. Now there's a path to permit these kinds of facilities based on emerging alternate shelter models around the city. The project also increased housing flexibility by allowing more types of group living configurations, such as single room occupancy or SRO units without a conditional use approval. And it also allowed occupancy of a recreational vehicle or tiny house on wheels on residential properties. We've heard a lot about inclusionary housing. This is one of our first projects out of the gate. So this requires that developments with more than 20 units in a single building provide some amount of those units as affordable housing. And there's two options that developers can use to meet this. So either 20% of the units within that project are affordable at 80% of the area median income, which is roughly $60,000 for a single person, or 10% of the units affordable at a 60% AMI, which is about $45,000 for a single person. And again, for comparison's sake, someone working a full-time job at a minimum wage in the Portland metro area earns about $30,000 a year. The policy prioritized on-site affordable unit creation over payment of fees in lieu or off-site units. Inclusionary housing projects are eligible for FAR bonuses and potential financial incentives such as fee waivers, 10-year tax abatements, and SDC waivers. Since becoming effective in 2017, the IH program has produced about 500 units, with another 500 under construction and another 500 units in the permitting process. The Housing Bureau is currently leading a calibration study to review the program. Recommendations from that study will be incorporated into the housing production strategy that Tom and his team are working on. And last but not least, the historic and conservation districts protect the cultural and architectural legacy of Portland's significant places. The 2035 comp plan also recognized these areas as places that can accommodate growth through complementary development and adaptive reuse of historic resources. These two projects focused on right-sizing and streamlining the tools and processes to enable more housing production, reserving more involved discretionary reviews for projects that required greater flexibility or had more potential to adversely impact the built environment or adjacent resources. The map on the right just shows the location of local historic districts and the expanded areas of design overlays that accompany the centers and corridors designations. And that is all I've got. Any questions?
Great job.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioner Lang?
Yeah, it just because of the time stuff, is it possible get the slide? Because questions were coming up, and if I could look at the slides again and kind of jot those down, and would that work?
Yeah.
Yeah, all the presentations are linked when I send out the meeting minutes, so you'll see them.
Okay.
And
If you have subsequent questions, we can, if you just let us know, we can kind of bring that back in some fashion or other through one of the trainings. We'll figure out how to incorporate it.
you bet.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. We are at time, so we will go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, maybe we should have like a little brunch or something, and housing development brunch.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to hear the.
Yeah, it's good seeing you.
Yeah.
Because one of the other things too is that there was, from I moved here from Missouri, and I do remember that there for any large housing development that was maybe over 20 units or whatever. There was a fee that the developer had to pay that went into a fund so that the state could build affordable housing. And the state would actually be in competition with private development. So it helped with the cost, because people could. The developers would have to be in competition with that state, funded property that was set, and it just balanced. And it wasn't as though that they couldn't. People are going to want to live in what they want to live in, and people will pay for the expensive property.
risque de cancer depuis les années 80, selon des archives retrouvées. Dans le scandale de la chlordécone, les juges ont estimé que la science ne pouvait pas prédire quelles conséquences ce pesticide aurait sur l'homme. De nouveaux éléments découverts par la cellule Investigation de Radio France viennent contredire cette version. Ah, putain. On ne sait jamais ce qui nous attend, le déminage des terres agricoles, envahissement de
Hello.
Rolex.
Can
Oh
you hear me?
yeah, I can hear you.
I can
And
hear
you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, so you figured it out.
You did figure it out.
Okay, do you want me to keep talking or? Let me know, because
No, I think we're
can,
good actually.
Okay, coming back.
However, the city made it so high because they didn't want people to do that. They
Right,
wanted the
that
affordable
pretty much
housing.
people are just doing the
Okay.
production.
Which pulled developers back as well.
Yes,
There's
yes.
a whole lot of
This is
nuance.
it.
There's
to
a
it.
lot. I was surprised to hear the 500, 500, 500 around IH since 2020. Like that's actually more.
Well, but when you think about it,
Then
it's somewhere in the permitting process, they still may
Correct.
not happen. So now you're down to 1,000, and of
Yeah,
those,
but since
500.
2020, that's more than.
No, I think you said 2017.
Okay, that's
which
when it
is
was implemented. Yeah, yeah. That's
So
still more
it's-
than I was.
Well, I'm interested to
Well, I
see
hope
how
I'm
the
not
review of-
sounding Pollyanna about
No,
these things
no.
at all. You know,
No,
I
great
don't-
questions.
Yeah.
I'm learning
Well,
a lot
the
too.
thing too,
Yeah.
because you mentioned costs and they were comparing like construction costs between us and Seattle. And,
Right.
You know, it's pretty comparable, except wages might be. But what I'd like to see is a comparison of soft costs. And how
Oh,
much
yeah.
does a project here cost
For
compared
permitting.
to a comparable city? somewhere else?
for soft
Because
costs.
there's hurdles there.
For SDCs and permitting.
Well, yeah, when we did Haslow,
Yeah.
we were out $4 million before we even started construction, and then it just built from there. So we paid $64 million in hard costs, and the total cost was
Makes it a little soft cost and affordable because we have all the lawyers we hired, the additional fees.
But we spent 20 hours in this room trying to get through design review. And
20 hours for that project?
Yeah.
Not all at once.
No, it was
that
over
must have been a
multiple
marathon.
days, but it was a marathon, and every time we came back, we had to have our architects do
Another
a
ad.
redesign.
Another
It was
ad.
for that.
I know. We
was
had a
over
project. We had a project where design commission insisted on leaching, which was not a siting project we had ever used. And so we were required to shut on our risk. Right, the materials.
Forgive me, but I'm thinking like now, I open my mouth, I probably shouldn't. I'll think about it.
Well, I think
probably
when we went through it the first time to when we did an office building,
Yeah.
night and day different.
Oh,
but-
yeah.
But the whole commission had changed.
Yes, there has been, yes. Don't forget the shortbread cookie.
Oh, I already had one.
Okay.
Oh my goodness. I know, I
Have a good
had
evening.
one.
We'll see ya.
Yeah, and thanks for the offer too, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, no problem. I'm just so grateful we have all this support and it doesn't have to be me figuring it out. I was telling Michael in our last neighborhood land use meeting, we literally just defaulted to moving our laptops around. We can't.
I know. I have have volunteer techs that help me with my meetings with EPA and the city and the state because I'm just like, you know, and I'm always trying to make sure that we're like have a gang together, you know, as a community group, you know, it's like you don't want to. You want to have everything kind of like lined up and ready to go.
Yes, it is.
We are serious. We're being business.
Julie, I wanted to ask you though about the piece I missed with getting commissioner input for the council letter. Should I just follow up with an email to the commission, or what do you recommend in terms of like if you have any points that you'd like to see?
What if I will send out these draft minutes tomorrow, I can put in a budget right now, and then we can talk a little bit about it.
At
Thanks.
I
They're like
know.
some of my favorite pants, and
They're
I've rediscovered them because now I'm coming back into the office.
They're
and I'm not wearing
totally-
like gym leggings all day anymore.
they just took me back to like